that all of these groups represent a single unified enemy that we're at war against in this so-called war on terror. We've even given them sort of a catchy name, Islamofascism. That's what we'll call it. And of course, that term itself is constructed to remind us in some ways of the noble wars of the last century fought against the fascist regimes in Germany, in Japan, in Italy. But in this case, it really falls flat for a couple of reasons. One, because Al-Qaeda and jihadism, as I began this conversation with, is, if anything, an anti-nationalist organization, whereas fascism is a theory of ultra-nationalism. To the jihadist, nationalism is a sin. It goes against everything that Islam stands for. At the same time, groups like Hezbollah and Hamas are terrorist organizations and yet also nationalist organizations that do have a very nationalist agenda. And more importantly, it's not so much that goals and ideologies are different between these groups. It's that they themselves can barely stand each other. They don't think of themselves as allies by any means. It may come as a shock to some of you to learn that among the first fatwas, among the first denunciations of the attacks of September 11th, 2001, was made by the leader, thank you very much, the spiritual leader Hussein Nasrallah of Hezbollah. In fact, in that statement, Nasrallah issued essentially a death warrant for Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden returned the favor not too long afterwards by issuing his own death warrant on Nasrallah. It's kind of a tit-for-tat sort of a thing. So, and of course, jihadism itself, and particularly Al-Qaeda, is a puritanical Sunni organization. It sees the Shia as heretics who must be slaughtered. And indeed, from the very beginning of jihadism as a movement about 120 years ago, its primary goal has been to rid the world of all Shia. So it becomes somewhat problematic for us to lump all of these groups into a single category, call it the other, give it a fancy name, and say that's what the war is against. The real fear of this kind of undifferentiated enemy status is that it makes the war itself almost impossible to win. I mean, how can you win a war when you're not exactly sure who the enemy is? But most importantly, we've done a far greater sin, I think, in this war on terror. And that is that we have allowed the jihadists, who are the true enemy in this war, the people who attacked this country on September 11th, that we have allowed them to essentially frame the context and the parameters of this conflict. What do I mean by this? I think it's important to understand that the jihadists recognize that they are embroiled in a conflict that cannot be won in any real or measurable terms. When you read their writings, when you read the declarations of Zawahiri or bin Laden or whomever, you get this sense all the time. They recognize quite clearly that their supposed goals, the recreation of a worldwide caliphate, the destruction of Israel, the defeat of the American military, these are impossible goals. They cannot be achieved in any kind of real or measurable way. And it is for that reason that they have reframed their struggle, they have reframed their conflict in cosmic terms. They are, in short, fighting not a real war, but a cosmic war. A war not between armies, but a war between the forces of good and the forces of evil. A heavenly battle between angels and demons. Now, the advantages to a cosmic war are, I think, in some ways kind of self-evident. It provides hope for victory when there really is no hope. But of course, victory in the heavenly realm, not on any kind of real terms. It turns warfare into a ritual drama, indeed into a religious drama. It is not a battle for territory. It is a battle fought in the heavenly realm. It is a religious act. It is part of one's religious identity, this conflict, this struggle. And in fact, very quickly, as we're seeing in jihadism, it becomes the sole identity of one's religion. War, jihad, nothing else. It turns enemies into demonic forces, into faceless demonic forces. It creates a polarization, an organization of the world into us and them. Anybody who's not part of us is part of them, and therefore the enemy. And not just an enemy, but a demonic enemy. They represent evil incarnate, and they must be destroyed, as the jihadists say. It is this ideology, by the way, that allows them to violate the very black and white rules of jihad and fight and kill non-combatants. Because in their viewpoint, there is no such thing as a non-combatant in a cosmic war. There is us and there is them, and if you're not us, then you're them. And it makes all earthly losses irrelevant. This is something that I think the Pentagon would do well heeding in some way. Because in some ways, we're sort of stuck in that Vietnam era measure of victory and loss. So every once in a while, you hear the body count of how many members of Al-Qaeda or how many jihadists we killed that day, as though that's important. Because any kind of earthly loss is totally irrelevant in the cosmic war, because the war is not going to be won in this plane. It is going to be won in the heavenly plane. This is also important too, because as most of you know, the president keeps a very large poster board behind his desk with faces of Al-Qaeda that he draws an X over every time we've killed one of them. Most importantly, it turns war into an absolute. It makes war and hostilities never-ending. Think about this. If what you're fighting for is not any kind of political ideology or even economic ideology, if what you're fighting for is not territory or anything like that, if what you're fighting for is identity, then losing is unthinkable. You cannot lose a cosmic war. In fact, it ensures that those hostilities go on for eternity because, of course, the very goal of a cosmic war is to vanquish evil from the world, which, by my calculations, is probably not going to happen in the next few weeks or months. It makes sure that this war for identity has no room for compromise, no room for settlement, no room for any kind of surrender. It is a war of the imagination. Now, I think some of you have already figured out where I'm going with this. Because far from debunking this twisted ideology of the jihadists, we have affirmed it in the worst way, with our own religiously polarizing rhetoric. It seems as though we have said from the very beginning that yes, indeed, this is a cosmic war, except that we're good and you're evil. This is a war between angels and demons, but the angels are fighting for us, and you're on the side of the demons. And so from the very beginning, when you heard the president launch this war as a crusade against evildoers, when you heard him say in the State of the Union address that the goal of this, as I said, is to vanquish evil from the earth, you're fighting a cosmic war. Now, in some ways, of course, no one can really blame a politician for appealing to the innate sense of moral righteousness of Americans. And no one is going to stand here and say that the actions of the jihadists are not evil. Of course they're evil. There's no question about that. But when you have the president say to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper 2 years ago, that God told him to remove Saddam Hussein from power, when you have the president's closest spiritual advisor, Franklin Graham,